Camera confusing? Not after this course. Hey everyone, welcome to DeepBlendArt. I'm thrilled to kick off our new series, The Art of Camera in Blender, with this session 0. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular here, I'm excited to have you on board. Today, we're diving into the essentials of working with cameras in Blender. So, grab a cup of coffee, fire up Blender, and let's get started. Unlike other Blender camera tutorials that might just focus on tools, we're going deeper in this course. Sure, we'll touch on the basics and tools in this session, but as we move forward, much like our lighting course, which you can check out if you haven't already, we'll explore how to use cameras purposefully. We'll figure out which camera settings work best for specific scenes and bowls. Later sessions, we'll dive into camera movement, styling, and how to evoke different moods and vibes through your camera choices. So, let's hit the ground running and see what we can create. Let's start with the basics, adding a camera in Blender. It's super simple. Just hit Shift-A or go to the Add menu and select Camera. Boom! There's your new camera in the scene. To check its view, press the 0 key to switch to the camera perspective. You can access the camera's settings in the Object Data Properties tab under the Data section. I'm assuming you're familiar with Blender's interface, so let's skip the beginner basics and jump straight into the camera settings. First up, let's talk about the lens. In Blender, you can choose between 3 camera types: perspective, orthographic, and panoramic. For this course, we'll focus on the most common and versatile type, perspective. This camera mimics real-world photography lenses and is what we'll base our lessons on. We'll explore other types in future courses, but for now, perspective is our go-to. The perspective camera can be defined in 2 ways: focal length or field of view. Let's start with focal length, measured in millimeters, just like real-world camera lenses. You can set it in the lens section. Options range from wide-angle lenses like 20 millimeters, which give a deep, stretched perspective where the background feels far from the foreground, giving you a wider view of the scene. Check this out. With a 20 millimeter lens, objects in the background, like buildings, seem stretched and distant from the foreground subjects like a car. Now, if we jump to 100 millimeter lens, the scene feels compressed. Background and foreground objects, like those billboards behind the car, appear closer together, almost as if they're right on top of each other. This compression reduces the field of view, making the shot feel tighter. For now, I'll stick with a standard 35 millimeter lens to keep things balanced. Alternatively, you can define the lens using field of view, which measures the angle the camera can see. For a 35 millimeter focal length, you get about 54.4 degrees. Increasing the field of view is like using a wider lens. It expands what the camera captures, similar to lowering the focal length. Decreasing it mimics a longer focal length, narrowing the view. In practice though, we usually stick with focal length in millimeters. It's the standard for most projects. Next up is lens shift, which lets you offset the camera's view along the X or Y axis without rotating it. Unlike regular rotation, where the camera physically turns, shifting tilts the lens, almost like the camera is leaning to one side. It's not something you'll use every day, but it's handy for specific scenarios like architectural shots or creative compositions. Let's move on to clipping planes, clip start and clip end. These control the range of distances the camera renders. Clip start sets how close objects can be to the camera before they're cut off. For example, if I increase clip start while in camera view, objects too close, like parts of a car, start disappearing. We usually set clip start to a low value like 0.1 to avoid cutting out nearby objects. Clip end works the same way, but for distant objects. If you lower it, the camera stops rendering far-off elements like the background or parts of the car. These settings are fully customizable to suit your scene. Now let's tackle sensor size, a critical setting that works hand in hand with focal length. Sensor size represents the physical size of the camera sensor, like the difference between a phone camera sensor and a professional cinema camera. Changing sensor size doesn't alter the lens itself, but affects how the scene is captured. For instance, I'm using a phone camera with a specific sensor size. Zooming in or out changes the focal length, but the sensor size stays fixed. It's a physical property. To simulate a specific camera, like a phone or a cinematic one, you first set the sensor size to match that camera's specs, then adjust the focal length within its range. Here's a practical example. If I set a camera with a sensor size of 35 and a focal length of 35 millimeters, I get a certain look. Now, if I duplicate that camera and change the focal length to 80 millimeters while keeping the sensor size at 35, the perspective compresses like we discussed earlier. But if I take another copy and set this sensor size to 80 with a focal length of 35 millimeters, the result is different. It's a wider view, despite the same focal length. Now, if I set both sensor size and focal length to 80, it matches the look of the 35 millimeter sensor size with the 35 millimeter focal length. And if I push the focal length to 120 millimeters with the sensor size of 80, the effect is even more pronounced. This shows how sensor size and focal length interact to shape your shot. Check your camera's real-world specs to replicate them accurately in Blender. Next, let's talk about safe areas. When enabled, these show dashed rectangles in the camera view, marking the safe zone for your shot. This ensures your main subjects stay visible on platforms like TVs or players that might crop the edges. There's also a center cut safe area for even stricter cropping, useful for older displays or specific platforms. You can customize these zones along the X and Y axes based on your target platform's requirements. For projects like VFX, where you might composite objects onto another scene, you can add a background image to your camera. For example, if I load a thumbnail image, it appears in the camera's background regardless of its position. This is super useful for aligning your 3D elements with the real-world plate. In the Viewport display settings, you've got some handy tools. The Limits option visualizes clip start and clip end, showing exactly where your camera cuts off objects. Mist defines the range where volumetric effects, like fog, are visible. Anything beyond that range disappears. The Sensor option displays the sensor size in the viewport, which updates as you tweak the sensor size. The Name option shows the camera's name in the viewport if viewport overlays are enabled. And Passport 2 controls the opacity of the area outside the camera's view. Set it to 1 to black out everything beyond the frame, or 0 to see the entire scene. Let's touch on composition guides, which we'll dive into more in later sessions. These are visual aids in the viewport, like the rule of thirds, which divides the frame into a 3x3 grid. The intersections of these lines are natural focal points for viewers' eyes. For example, placing objects, like a car, at these intersections draws attention naturally. Other guides, like center or center diagonal, help with framing and composition. We'll explore these in depth later, but for now, know they're key for creating balanced shots. Finally, let's cover depth of focus, which controls focus and blur. If I set the focal length to 100 millimeters and sensor size to 35, you'll see a focused area with blurred foreground and background. You can set focus using Focus Object, select an object like a car, and the camera keeps it sharp even if you move. Alternatively, set focus distance to a specific range like 25 meters and the focus stays there regardless of objects. Aperture settings like f-number control the blur intensity. At f/2.8, the blur is subtle. At f/1.4 or f/0.5, the foreground and background get progressively blurrier, emphasizing the focused area, like the car. Blades set the shape of bokeh effects. 3 blades give triangular bokeh, 5 give pentagonal. Rotation, like 45 degrees, tilts the bokeh shapes. Ratio adjusts bokeh distortion. 1 keeps them smooth, 2 makes them linear, and 0.5 makes them soft and blended. These are great for adding realism or stylizing your shots. That's a wrap for session 02. We've covered the core camera settings in Blender and set a solid foundation for the rest of the course. In the coming sessions, we'll dive into the artistic side, camera movement, styling, and how to convey mood and story through your shots. Thanks for joining me today, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. If you found this helpful, give it a like, subscribe to DeepBlendArt, and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any updates. Until next time, happy blending!